So we have been talking about these complicated things in our lives called relationships, about the God who exists forever in community of Father, Son, and Spirit, and who calls us also to live in community and relationship with one another. Now, today, I want to talk about conflict. And so those of you whose relationships are all smooth sailing, those of you who don't have that arch nemesis at work, you know the one? Those of you who don't have disagreements that snowball into fights with the people you love, you people can just tune out. And I'll talk to the rest of us who live with relationships that have ups and downs, that have good days and bad days, relationships where sometimes everything goes great and sometimes it's definitely not. Because every relationship has conflict. Every relationship has disagreement. It's this place where what I want conflicts with what you want, where what I expect you to be conflicts with what you actually are. That's the place we call conflict. And it happens in every single relationship. There is not a relationship that does not at some point have conflict in one way, shape, or form. Whether you're talking good friends or neighbors or coworkers or spouses or parents and children, every relationship at some point has this crashing together that we call conflict. Thankfully, Paul was the sort of person that crashed together with a lot of people. Paul, if you've been reading the letters of Paul and Acts with me in our Bible studies, you know that Paul had this big, huge personality, and he very definitely wanted things to be his way, and so very often he had conflict with others. And so he writes this beautiful passage in Ephesians 4 about managing conflict and relationships because, he had a lot of them that did not go well. Literally, people wanted to kill him and tried to do so. He had real conflict with people, and so this thing is not new. It's happened for as long as people have been, people. And so we come to our faith. We say, what do we do when we encounter conflict? Paul gives us some guidance. And I think he's very, very right that the center of our conflicts very often is not in our heart because we love these people. That's why we're in relationship with them. It's not in our heads. We're pretty reasonable people. It's in our mouths. The center of most conflicts that we have with other people is about what we say and what they say. And the key to resolving most conflicts is the same. It's about what we say and, more importantly, what we don't say. Paul says in Ephesians 4:2, conduct yourselves with all humility, gentleness, and patience. Humility, gentleness, and patience. I want you someday to turn on the evening news and count the times that you see humility, gentleness, and patience. It's not often. Humility, gentleness, and patience run counter to everything that we are taught to do. We are taught to stand up for ourselves, to tell people how wrong they are, to make our point strongly, to make sure the other person knows that they're wrong and an idiot and a fool. Humility, gentleness, and patience. Write those words down somewhere. Inscribe them on the back of your eyeballs. Humility, gentleness, and patience. Now, to be clear, humility we sometimes get confused about. We sometimes think, oh, well, humility means that David's not good at anything, and I can't do anything right. Right? Like humility is beating up on ourselves. That is not humility. That's self-pity. Self-pity is different than humility. Humility is not thinking less about myself. It's thinking about myself less. Say that again. Humility is not thinking less of myself. It's thinking about myself less. So, as I get into conflict with another person, I might begin by thinking to myself, well, my feelings are hurt. Well, I am right. How could they do that to me? Humility says, I wonder why they said that. I wonder how they feel. I wonder what my words, what their effect were on them. Humility is about centering the story on the other person instead of on myself. Humility, gentleness, and patience. That's the one I have trouble with. Patience. Humility, gentleness, and patience. Ephesians 4:2. Accept each other with love. So we start there. We start in our brains with what we think by moving the center of the story off of me and the spotlight off of me and my experience and becoming curious about the other person. Because if I care about this other person that I'm in relationship with, and we should, regardless of who they are, love your neighbor as yourself. If I care about this person that I'm in relationship with, then their experience and feelings and thoughts matter too. Now, there's this thing that happens. I want to step away from Scripture for just a second, and I want to turn to our science textbooks, our biology textbooks, and there's this thing that happens. You have two parts of your brain, right? So back here in the back, you've got your lizard brain, right? This is where your fight or flight instinct lives, right? When you get up on a high bridge, right, and you look down, and your body goes, ah! That's this part of the brain. This part of the brain is the prefrontal cortex. That's where you make smart, rational decisions. That's where you reason out between right and between wrong. Now, it's not fully developed till you're 25. And so when you look at your teenage children and you think, what were they thinking? They weren't. That's exactly right, Sarai. They didn't have that part of their brain yet. Which makes me wonder about all the things that we entrust and require children to do prior to that point, but that's a whole other topic. So this is the part of the brain where all of your smart decisions come from. And here's the thing. When you get angry, your brain literally shuts down the smart part of your brain and goes back into the fight or flight part of your brain. You get dumb. You literally close down part of your brain. Which is why sometimes the best thing you can do when you get angry is just shut your mouth. Because you're not thinking through humility and gentleness and patience. You're operating out of that angry part of your brain that doesn't think in terms of reason and logic. Paul talks about this too. He says this wonderful line in Ephesians 4:29. He says, don't let any foul words come out of your mouth. Now, we think about foul language and we think of those wonderful lists of 4-letter words, right? The dirty words. The words that make every junior high kid giggle. Paul's not talking about those. When he talks about foul language, he's not talking about being vulgar. The word foul, it's like spoiled milk, rotten fish. Don't let any words that spoil the relationship come out of your mouth. Because then he goes on to say what that means. Don't let any foul words come out of your mouth. Only say what is helpful. Exactly. There's a mantra I was taught. Does it need to be said? Does it need to be said right now? Does it need to be said right now by me? Does it need to be said? Does it need to be said right now? Does it need to be said right now by me? Foul words are not things that get you an R rating or a PG-13 rating. Foul words are those things that are not helpful. Foul words, he goes on to say, are those words that do not build up the community, that do not benefit those who hear what you have to say. Now, when we get angry, what we do is we think, well, I need to say this. I need to get this off my chest. I need to tell you something. Foul words, says Paul. What do you need to hear? What would help and build up my relationship with you? Is it helpful? Daughter had that wonderful sign in her elementary school one time when I was driving through or walking through to her classroom, and I love it, right? The acronym THINK. You've probably heard this before. Think. Before you speak, think. Is it true? Is it helpful? Is it inspiring? Is it necessary? And is it kind? True, helpful, inspiring, necessary, and kind. Does it need to be said, and does it need to be said by me? You see, it's not the words themselves, it's the impact of those words. Now again, remember, what happens is we get into a disagreement with someone and they push our buttons. And the thing is, the better your relationship with someone, the more they know where your buttons are. Family of origin, for example. Our family of origin, our parents, our siblings, they're the ones who installed our buttons. They know exactly where they are. Our spouses, our coworkers that we've worked with for decades, our best friends, they know where your buttons are. You know, the nuclear bomb button, the argument ending button, the I'm going to get 'em button. And so when we get angry and the smart part of our brain shuts down and the survival part of our brain turns on, it says, I have to win. So I'm going to smash that big red button. I'm going to say that thing that I know is hurtful and will shut them down. I'm going to say that thing that I know cuts to the core of who they are. So perhaps, again, when we feel ourselves getting to that point, when we feel like we've become exposed and overly angry and worked up, stop. Take a breath. Paul says, be angry, sure, but do not let your anger cause you to sin. Do not let your anger cause you to sin. To be right and to ruin the relationship is to lose. To be right and to hurt the other person is to lose. To be right because you've used the nuclear option is to lose. Only say, says Paul, what is helpful. And so we are gentle and we speak with kindness. When we get angry, perhaps we speak less and we are forgiving. We speak mercy. That's that last thing. So at the end of this section, he says, those are the things that ought to guide us, that we ought to be gentle, that we ought to control our anger, and that we ought to be forgiving as God has forgiven us. So we begin with this idea of being gentle. We learn when we are angry to pause and to stop and to breathe and to make space. And finally, to be forgiving, to speak mercy. Forgiveness is hard, especially when we're angry. More often than not, forgiveness is about making space for mercy. To be clear, you could be in a relationship with someone that winds up in a disagreement, and I've yet to have it happen to me, but you can be completely right. It happens, I'm told. You still have to make space for mercy. Pause and step back. Acknowledge the other person. Acknowledge their hurt and their anger and their frustration, and give them space to be merciful back to you. Give them space for healing in your relationship. Give them space for forgiveness. Forgiving looks a number of different ways. As we've been talking about, as we read about South Africa and no future without forgiveness, forgiveness does not mean pretending that nothing happened. Forgiveness, though, begins, if acknowledging the other person and the gentleness at the beginning of the relationship begins by acknowledging them, forgiveness begins with, I was wrong. Mercy in a relationship begins by admitting your own faults and your own flaws. I was wrong when I said that. Hey, I know that we agreed X, and I didn't do X, and I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Now, forgiveness does not look like what it often looked like with me and my two brothers, right? Fine, I'm sorry. Fine. I was wrong when I did this or said this, and I'm sorry. And I'm going to do things differently. That is the pathway that Paul gives us. It is a pathway of relationships that are gentle, that are aware of the effect of anger on how we act and speak, and is forgiving. And it centers not in what we think, but in how we act toward the other person, what the effect is of what we say and do. I can be 100% right and say everything 100% right, but if at the end of the day, if I leave the other person hurt and in a pile, I've failed them in our relationship. Back to Ephesians. Only say what is helpful when is needed for building up, so that it benefits those who hear what you say. Closes. Put aside all bitterness. Put away that losing of your temper, anger, shouting, slander, calling bad names, along with every other sort of evil. All those sorts of anger-induced evil. And instead, be kind, compassionate, and forgiving. Kind, compassionate, forgiving. Your relationships will hit snags. Your relationships will have conflict and tension from everybody that you ever interact with. It will always be there. The difference is what we do when that conflict happens. The difference that lets the glory and the light of the kingdom of God shine forth is what we do when the conflict happens. Are we just like everybody else, slinging mud, assuming the worst, and out to win? Or are we conducting ourselves with humility, gentleness, and patience?